have you ever watched someone make a decision so fast, so confidently, that by the time they realized how wrong they were, the damage was already done? Because that was exactly how this began. Not with sirens, not with violence, not even with suspicion. It began with a glance. A single glance from a patrol car rolling slow beneath the orange wash of a city sunset, where heat still clung to the pavement and the road shimmered just enough to make everything look slightly unreal. It was the kind of evening that made people careless. The kind that stretched a second too long at every red light and convinced everyone the night would unfold exactly the way they expected it to. For Officer Daniel Pike, that expectation was routine. He had spent 11 years in uniform and had built his confidence the way men like him often did, through repetition mistaken for instinct. Long shifts, familiar roads, split-second judgments that had gone unchallenged often enough to harden into certainty. By the time most officers reached his level, they either learned humility or learned how to confuse comfort with competence. Pike had chosen the second path years ago. He sat behind the wheel of Unit 12 with one arm draped over the door, scanning traffic with the relaxed boredom of a man who had already decided most of what he saw before he actually saw it. Beside him, Officer Trent Holloway scrolled through dispatch updates on the dash-mounted screen, half listening to the radio and half listening to Pike complain about overtime, paperwork, and the city's latest attempt to tighten policy on discretionary stops. "It's all politics now," Pike muttered, eyes still on the road. Nobody wants officers making judgment calls until something goes wrong. Then suddenly they want initiative. Holloway grunted in vague agreement, the kind younger officers often used when they hadn't yet learned whether silence was safer than opinion. Trent Holloway was only 3 years in. Young enough to still care how he looked in uniform. Young enough to think experience and confidence were the same thing. He was competent in the way junior officers often are, quick, obedient, and still unsure enough to borrow certainty from whoever sat beside them. And tonight, that certainty belonged to Pike. Traffic was light. The city was shifting from rush hour into evening rhythm. Storefronts glowed. Neon signs flickered awake. Engines purred through intersections. It should have been forgettable. Then Pike saw her. At first, she was just movement. A black superbike gliding between lanes with surgical control, low and sleek beneath the fading light. Not weaving recklessly, not racing, just moving with the kind of confidence that made lesser drivers look clumsy by comparison. The bike cut through traffic like it belonged to a different logic than the rest of the road. Smooth, fast, precise. Then Pike saw the rider. Black woman, leather jacket, full-face helmet, calm posture, controlled throttle, no panic in the ride, no visible hesitation in the lane changes. She moved like someone who knew exactly how much machine sat beneath her and exactly what it could do. That should have been the end of it. An experienced rider, a clean line, nothing urgent. But men like Pike did not process scenes in neutral. They processed them in narrative. And the narrative formed instantly. Young, black, fast bike, evening traffic, confident posture. His eyes narrowed. "Look at that," he said. Holloway looked up. The superbike slid past a line of slower cars and settled neatly into the next lane without breaking control. "She's moving," Holloway said. Pike gave a short laugh. "Yeah," he replied, "and she wants us to notice." That was the first mistake. Not the stop, not the cuffs, not even what came later. The first mistake was assumption dressed as observation. The rider ahead was not speeding dangerously, not swerving, not provoking, but Pike had already begun assembling the kind of story he preferred most, the kind where instinct arrived first and evidence came later to justify it. He straightened in his seat. "Run her." Holloway keyed the plate into the system. The bike remained ahead, cutting clean through traffic, engine humming low and controlled. A second passed, then another. "No immediate flags," Holloway said. "Registered clean." Pike kept watching her. No priors, nothing attached. That should have ended it too. Clean registration. No active alerts. No visible threat. Routine. Forgettable. But Pike had already crossed the line officers like him crossed long before policy ever entered the conversation. He had become interested. And interest, when filtered through ego, is rarely neutral. "Stay on her," Pike said. Holloway glanced at him. "For what?" Pike didn't answer right away. He just watched the bike glide through another light, precise and controlled, the rider never once looking over, never once acknowledging the cruiser tucked 3 cars back. Then he said it. "Let's see where she thinks she's going." That was how it started. Not because a crime had been committed. Not because a threat had emerged. But because one man saw confidence where he expected caution and decided it needed to be explained. Ahead, the rider tilted slightly into the next turn, smooth as clockwork, unaware that behind her 2 officers had already stopped watching her behavior and started watching the story they had built around it. And by the time the lights came on, nobody in Unit 12 understood they had already made the most expensive mistake of the night. Watch closely, because the next 9 minutes would cost all of them more than they realized. Have you ever noticed how fast authority changes its tone the moment it decides it already knows who you are? Because the second Pike flipped on the lights, that was exactly what happened. The cruiser's red and blue strobes cut across the evening traffic in violent pulses, splashing color over windows, asphalt, chrome, and glass. Cars shifted. Brake lights bloomed. The city made room the way it always did when power announced itself loud enough. Ahead, the Superbike rider noticed immediately. Her posture changed by less than an inch. That was the first thing Pike didn't like. No panic. No sharp correction. No sudden, nervous hesitation. Just a clean signal, a controlled merge, and a smooth deceleration toward the shoulder with the same calm precision she had shown in traffic. No attempt to run. No reckless turn. No confusion. She simply acknowledged the stop and complied. Most officers would have registered that for what it was. Routine compliance. Pike registered it as attitude. "There it is," he muttered. Holloway glanced at him. "What?" "That calm," Pike said, already reaching for his door. "People get that calm when they think rules work differently for them." That was the second mistake. He mistook composure for defiance. The bike came to a complete stop beneath a fading bank sign and a wash of neon from a convenience store across the street. The engine idled low for a moment, then cut. The rider swung one boot down, steady and balanced, and rested both hands visibly on the handlebars. Again, compliance. Again, Pike saw something else. He stepped out of the cruiser with the familiar authority of a man who had never needed to separate command from performance. Holloway followed half a step behind, hand near his belt, posture still learning what kind of stop this was supposed to become. The rider remained seated, helmet on, still. Pike approached from the left, already annoyed by the silence. "Kill the engine," he barked. A beat. Then the rider turned her head slowly toward him. The engine was already off. That was the third mistake. He gave a command not because it was needed, but because he needed to establish control before the interaction had even begun. The rider said nothing, just lifted one gloved hand and tapped the ignition. Off. Pike felt the correction like a challenge. "You got a problem following instructions?" he asked. Her voice came calm through the helmet. "No, officer." Controlled. Even. No tremor. Pike disliked her immediately. Not because she had resisted. Because she had not given him anything to push against. "License and registration." She nodded once. "My registration is in the side compartment. License is in my jacket. I'm going to reach slowly." Again, clear, compliant, predictable. Exactly what officers are trained to want. Pike heard none of it the way it was offered. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Her hand stopped mid-motion. A pause. Then, still calm, "You just asked for my license and registration." Holloway glanced sideways. Small sentence. Simple fact. But Pike heard contradiction. And contradiction, to men already committed to their own authority, sounds a lot like disrespect. You giving instructions now?" Pike snapped. The rider went still again. "No, officer." That answer should have cooled the stop. Instead, Pike leaned closer. "Then do exactly what I say, when I say it." A beat. "Understood." A pause. Then, "Understood." Everything about her was controlled. Too controlled, Pike thought. Too measured. Too careful. He had already decided what kind of person performed calm under pressure like that. Not disciplined. Manipulative. He stepped back slightly. "Take off the helmet." The rider didn't move immediately. Not defiance. Calculation. Then she spoke. "Officer, before I remove the helmet, I'd like to know the reason for the stop." That was the moment the air changed. Holloway felt it first. Not because anything had escalated. Because Pike had just been handed the one thing men like him hated most in roadside encounters. A reasonable question. Pike's jaw tightened. "You'd like to know," he repeated. Her voice stayed level. "Yes, officer. That should have been easy." Speed concern. Lane movement. Routine stop. Any simple explanation would have kept the interaction inside normal boundaries. But Pike had already moved too far into performance to retreat into procedure. "You were moving aggressively." The rider answered immediately. "No, I wasn't. Not louder. Not sharper. Just factual." And that was enough. Holloway saw Pike stiffen. Saw the shift happen in real time. This was no longer about the stop. It was about contradiction. Pike stepped closer again. "Take off the helmet. Now." The rider held still for one breath too long. Then reached up slowly and removed it. Dark skin. Sharp eyes. Early 30s. Hair pulled tight beneath the helmet, clean and controlled. No fear. No apology. No visible urgency to make herself smaller for his comfort. Pike looked at her face and decided he disliked her even more. Not because of what she had done. Because she still looked too composed. He had expected nervousness. He had expected explanation. He had expected the reflexive softness people often offered uniformed men to make encounters end faster. Instead he got stillness. And stillness, to insecure authority, feels like resistance. "What's your name?" Pike asked. She met his eyes. "Monica Reed." No tremor. No stutter. Pike held the silence a second too long. Then smiled without warmth. "Step off the bike, Monica." Not Ms. Reed. Not, "Ma'am, Monica." The kind of deliberate familiarity meant to reduce distance only in one direction. She noticed. So did Holloway. Monica swung one leg off the bike and stood. Tall. Controlled. Leather jacket zipped. Gloves still on. Hands visible. No sudden movement. No threat. Pike circled half a step, already searching for escalation. "Do you always argue with officers during traffic stops?" Monica answered calmly. "I asked why I was pulled over." Pike tilted his head, and then told me I was wrong. Monica held his stare. "I told you I wasn't driving aggressively." There it was again. Not emotion. Not attitude. Just correction. And Pike had reached the point where correction itself felt intolerable. He stepped in closer. Too close. "Turn around." Holloway looked at him. "Pike." But Pike was already committed. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." That was the moment the stop stopped being routine. Monica didn't move. Not because she was resisting. Because now, for the first time, even she was recalculating what kind of officer she was dealing with. And behind Pike's shoulder, Holloway felt the first real flicker of unease. Because somewhere in the last 90 seconds, this had become something else. And all three of them knew it. Have you ever seen a moment go too far before anyone in it was willing to admit it? That was the moment. It happened in silence. Not loud silence. Not dramatic silence. The kind that tightens the air so fast everyone inside it feels the shape of the mistake before anyone says it out loud. Monica stood beside the bike, helmet in one hand, the city's neon bleeding across black paint and chrome. Traffic moved behind them in long streaks of light, indifferent and distant. To anyone passing, it still looked like a routine stop. It was no longer routine. Pike stood too close, one hand already hovering near his cuffs, posture squared in that familiar stance officers use when they've decided compliance must now be extracted instead of requested. "Hands behind your back," he repeated. Monica didn't move, not because she was refusing, because she was measuring his tone, his distance, his intent, and more importantly, how much of this was ego and how much had already become procedural risk. When she spoke, her voice was still level. "Am I being detained?" Holloway felt his stomach tighten. That question should have forced a reset. It was direct, legal, clean. One of those moments officers are trained to answer carefully because once it's asked, everything after it acquires weight. Pike didn't answer carefully. "You're being instructed." That was not an answer. Monica knew it. Holloway knew it. Pike knew it too. But Pike had already reached the point where clarity felt like concession. Monica set her helmet carefully on the seat of the bike. No sudden movement. Then she looked directly at him. On what grounds? There it was again. Not defiance. Precision. And precision, when ego is already overheated, feels like provocation. Pike stepped closer. "I'm not repeating myself." Monica held his stare. "You haven't answered the question." Holloway saw Pike's jaw tighten hard enough to shift the muscles in his face. That was the exact second this stopped being about law. It became about control in front of a witness. Because Holloway was there. Because traffic was passing. Because Monica was calm. And because Pike had begun to feel what men like him always mistake for disrespect when they're no longer in full command of a conversation. Exposure. He reached for her wrist. Fast. Not violent enough to justify panic. Not procedural enough to justify itself. Just force introduced too early by a man trying to recover authority he felt slipping. Monica reacted instantly, not by striking, not by jerking away, but by shifting her weight back and pulling one arm just enough to stop him from taking control of it cleanly. Reflex. Measured. Defensive. Pike felt resistance and translated it into escalation. "There it is," he snapped. Resisting. Holloway's head turned sharply. She wasn't resisting. She was protecting her balance. He knew it. Monica knew it. Pike had just said it anyway. That was the fourth mistake. Not the grab, the label. Because once, resisting, enters the air, officers stop responding to behavior and start responding to narrative. Monica's voice sharpened for the first time, not louder, just firmer. "Do not put your hands on me without cause." Pike heard only one thing in that sentence. "Do not." His grip tightened. "Hands behind your back." Now. Monica pulled once, controlled, deliberate, not an attempt to flee, just enough to break the angle of his hold. "State the charge." That was when Pike lost what little remained of restraint. He grabbed for both wrists. Holloway stepped forward instinctively. "Pike." Wrong tone. Wrong timing. Pike ignored him. Monica's posture changed in a single beat, not aggressive, not panicked, but braced. Her shoulders locked. Her weight grounded. The kind of reaction trained professionals default to when they realize they are no longer dealing with uncertainty, but misuse of force. And Pike noticed that too. He just interpreted it wrong. "Stop resisting." He barked, louder now, loud enough for passing drivers to hear, loud enough to create the public version of events before the facts had settled. That was the fifth mistake. Volume is narrative. Monica's eyes hardened, not with fear, with recognition. She had seen this type before. Men who escalated first and explained later. Men who weaponized tone to pre-write justification. Her voice came colder now. "Take your hands off me." Pike moved to force her arm behind her back. Monica shifted again, planted, refusing leverage without striking back. It was clean, controlled, disciplined. And to Pike, it was intolerable. Because by now he had fully crossed into the one thing dangerous officers never realize they've become until it's too late. Personally invested. Holloway moved in again, closer now. "Pike, slow down." But Pike was past slowing down. Monica's arm twisted under his grip. Holloway saw her wince, Small, controlled, involuntary. Still no panic. Still no lashing out. Still no threat. And somehow that made it worse. Because Pike was now applying force to someone who refused to become the kind of suspect his behavior required her to be. Last warning, Pike snapped. Monica turned her head just enough to look directly at him. And when she spoke, her voice was no longer defensive. It was exact. If you put me in cuffs without articulable cause, this stop becomes unlawful. The sentence hit like a blade. Not because it was emotional. Because it was precise enough to expose everything already going wrong. Holloway felt it instantly. Pike did too. And that was the real danger. Because insecure authority can survive challenge. What it cannot survive is being accurately named in real time. Pike's face changed. Not anger. Something worse. Embarrassment turning into force. He yanked her arm back hard enough to break the balance she had been protecting. Monica stumbled once. That was all he needed. Pike drove her into the side of the bike, metal shuddering under the impact, and reached for the cuffs. And in that exact second, with chrome rattling under force and Holloway stepping in too late to stop it, the stop crossed the line it could never uncross. Have you ever watched someone realize too late that the moment they were trying to control had already become evidence? That realization began for Holloway the instant Monica hit the side of the bike. The impact was hard enough to rattle the frame and send a sharp metallic crack through the air. Not a crash. Not enough to drop her. Just enough to turn a bad stop into something far more dangerous, the kind of force that changes paperwork, scrutiny, and careers depending on who saw it and how clearly they could explain it later. Holloway saw all of that in 1 second. Pike saw none of it. He was already too far inside the moment. Monica caught herself against the bike before going down, one gloved hand braced against the seat, the other trapped in Pike's grip. Her balance returned almost instantly. So did her composure. That was what unsettled Holloway most. She didn't panic, didn't shout, didn't flail. She stabilized. Like this was not the first time she had been forced to calculate in motion. Pike interpreted the recovery as resistance. He forced her wrist higher. Stop resisting. He shouted again, louder now, the words aimed as much at the street as at her. Traffic slowed. A few drivers turned. A man outside the convenience store stopped mid-step. Witnesses. Holloway felt the stop change shape all over again. This was no longer a roadside interaction. It was now a public incident. And Pike, whether he understood it or not, had begun performing for the version of events he planned to tell later. Monica turned her head, breath steady despite the pressure on her arm. Her voice came tighter now, not afraid, not pleading, just sharpened by pain. I am not resisting. Pike jerked her arm higher. Hands behind your back. They are because you're forcing them there. The sentence landed clean and devastating. Even Holloway felt it, because it was true. And truth, spoken clearly in the middle of force, has a way of making bad decisions feel instantly visible. Pike's face hardened. He hated that she was still speaking like this. Still measured. Still coherent. Still not becoming the chaotic suspect he needed her to become. 28:04, 9:50 a.m. Moawas Naeem. He reached for the cuffs. Monica twisted, not to strike, not to break free, but to relieve the torque on her shoulder. Pike barked immediately. There it is. That was the sixth mistake. He had stopped describing behavior. He was now narrating his own justification in real time. Holloway stepped in close. Pike, enough. Low voice. Tight tone. A warning, not to Monica, but to him. Pike ignored it. He caught one cuff around Monica's wrist. Metal clicked. That sound changed everything. Because cuffs do something words don't. They transform bad judgment into formal action. And formal action demands formal justification. Monica felt the cuff lock around one wrist and went completely still. Not fear. Decision. When she spoke next, the temperature in her voice changed so sharply even Holloway felt it. No more argument. No more roadside caution. just controlled finality. "Officer," she said, "take the cuff off." Pike laughed once under his breath. Too late for that. Monica turned her head enough to look directly at Holloway. Not Pike. Holloway. That was the first moment he understood something was wrong in a way he had not yet measured. Because her eyes had changed. Not frightened. Not angry. Certain. And certainty under pressure does one of two things. Either it's bluff, or it belongs to someone who knows exactly what happens next. Her voice was calm again. Colder now. "Ask him to remove the cuff." Holloway hesitated, not because he didn't hear her. Because for the first time all night, instinct was no longer pointing toward Pike. It was pointing away from him. Pike tightened his hold. "You don't give orders here." Monica didn't look at him. Still to Holloway. "Ask him now." There was no emotion in it. No performance. No threat. And somehow that made it worse. Because people bluff with volume. They warn with ego. Only people who are absolutely certain speak that quietly after a cuff clicks shut. Holloway looked at Pike, then at Monica, then back again, and for the first time since the lights came on, uncertainty hit him hard enough to feel physical. "Pike," he said carefully, "let's slow this down." Wrong answer. Pike heard hesitation in Holloway's voice and read it as disloyalty. We're past slowing down. That was the seventh mistake. Not force. Commitment to force. Monica inhaled once, controlled and measured, then finally spoke the sentence that shifted the entire night onto a different axis. "My name is Special Agent Monica Reed." Holloway froze. Pike did not. Because Pike was no longer listening for information. Only challenge. He gave a short, humorless smile. "Sure it is." Monica held Holloway's stare. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Off-duty. My credentials are inside my jacket." Silence. Traffic still moving. Lights still flashing. One cuff on. One officer holding too tight. One officer suddenly very aware that the next 10 seconds were about to decide which version of this night would survive the report. Pike laughed again. Sharp. Dismissive. "Everybody's something when cuffs come out." Monica didn't blink. Then verify it. And for the first time since the stop began, Holloway no longer felt like the junior officer on a routine pullover. He felt like the only person standing between a bad stop and a catastrophic one. Have you ever felt the exact second a situation stops being tense and starts becoming dangerous in a way no one can walk back from? Holloway felt it the moment Monica said the words. Special Agent Monica Reed, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The title hit the air and seemed to split the entire stop into two versions of reality. In one version, she was bluffing. In the other, Pike had just cuffed a federal agent on a public street, without charge, without cause, and in front of witnesses. Holloway did not know which version was true. But he knew, instantly and with terrifying clarity, that only one of those versions could survive the next 60 seconds. Pike still had hold of Monica's arm. Still too tight. Still too committed. Still operating inside the version of events he had built before she ever took off the helmet. He gave a short laugh, one meant to project certainty but brittle around the edges now. FBI, he repeated. That what we're doing? Monica didn't answer him. She was still looking at Holloway. Not pleading. Not trying to convince. Just waiting to see whether at least one officer on the scene still understood what verification was for. Inside pocket, she said calmly. Left side. Credentials wallet. Holloway's pulse kicked hard once. Pike barked before he could move. Don't. Holloway looked at him. Pike's eyes were still locked on Monica. She's trying to control the stop. That sentence told Holloway everything he needed to know. Pike had crossed too far. This was no longer about procedure. It was about preserving his version of authority long enough to survive the possibility that she was telling the truth. And if she was, Holloway's mind finished the thought for him. Use of force, unlawful detention, improper arrest, interference with a federal agent, witnesses, body cams, traffic cams, public civilian observation, A convenience store security feed. The entire stop suddenly rearranged itself in his head, not as it felt in the moment, but as it would look later under review. And it looked bad. Monica spoke again, same calm, same tone. "Verify my credentials." Pike jerked her arm once. "Shut up." That was the eighth mistake. Not tactical, not legal, psychological. Because the moment an officer tells someone to stop speaking instead of proving them wrong, everyone else hears the fear underneath it. Holloway heard it, and once he heard it, he could not unhear it. "Pike," he said, more firmly now. "Check the ID." Pike turned his head sharply. For the first time all night, the anger on his face was not aimed at Monica. It was aimed at his partner. "She says jump and now you jump." Holloway held his ground. "That's not what this is." Pike's voice dropped lower. "More dangerous." "Then what is it?" Holloway answered without taking his eyes off him. "Verification." The word landed like a threat because in moments like this, verification is the enemy of ego. Pike stared at him. For one long second Holloway thought he might refuse. And that was the moment Holloway understood the real danger wasn't just that Pike might be wrong. It was that Pike already suspected he might be. Monica remained still, one cuff on, one wrist pinned, no struggle, no panic. Just the kind of discipline that had started looking less like composure and more like training. Holloway could see it now. Not just in the way she spoke. In the way she held tension. The way she conserved motion. The way she measured every word before using it. Not civilian calm. Professional control. He stepped forward. "Pike." Low voice. Final tone. "Check the credentials." Pike's jaw flexed. His hand stayed locked on Monica's wrist another second too long. Then, finally, he looked at Holloway with the kind of expression men wear when they realize backing down and pressing forward now carry different kinds of risk. "Fine," he snapped. He shoved the words out like compliance itself offended him. "Get them." Holloway moved carefully. Every second now felt loaded enough to fracture. He stepped to Monica's left side, slow enough to stay visible, careful enough not to turn a bad stop into a worse one. "Left inside pocket?" he asked. Monica nodded once. "Yes." No triumph, no edge, no satisfaction, just confirmation. Holloway reached carefully into the inside pocket of her leather jacket. He felt it immediately. A credential wallet. Heavy, structured, real leather, not improvised. His stomach dropped before he even opened it. He pulled it free, flipped it open beneath the wash of red and blue light, and saw the shield. Gold. Federal. Then the photo. Monica Reed. Special Agent. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a second, all sound seemed to flatten. Traffic still moved. The light bar still flashed. The city still breathed around them. But Holloway heard none of it the same way. Because the stop had just split open. He looked up. Met Monica's eyes, and in that instant, the certainty in hers became the certainty in his. She hadn't warned them. She had given them chances. Holloway turned the credential toward Pike, and watched the color leave his face. Have you ever watched certainty die in real time? Not fade, not weaken, die. That was what happened to Daniel Pike when Holloway turned the credentials toward him. The badge caught the red and blue strobe first, gold flashing under patrol lights in a way that looked almost unreal for half a second. Then the lettering came into focus. Then the seal. Then the photograph. Then the name. Special Agent Monica Reed, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Pike stared at it too long. Not because he was reading it. Because his mind had stalled in the space between recognition and consequence. The street did not stop moving. Cars still passed. Neon still flickered. A bus rolled through the intersection 2 lanes over. But for Pike, the night had already split cleanly in half. Everything before the badge, everything after it, and he understood, instantly and with sickening clarity, that the version of events he had been constructing since he first saw the bike was now collapsing under its own weight. Holloway watched it happen in his face. The anger went first, then the certainty. Then the posture. What replaced it was not guilt. Not yet. It was calculation. Fast, desperate, humiliating calculation. How many cameras? How many witnesses? How much audio? How much of this had already become permanent? Monica was still pinned in place by one cuff. Still composed. Still saying nothing. That silence did more damage than accusation could have. Because now the entire stop existed in contrast. Her restraint. His. Holloway lowered the credential slightly but kept it visible. He didn't need to say what it was. The badge had already said enough. Pike swallowed once, then finally looked at Monica. Really looked at her for the first time all night. Not as a rider, not as a stop, not as a problem, as a federal agent standing cuffed on a city street while he held the wrist he never should have touched. And the humiliation of that realization hit him harder than fear. Because fear comes after. Humiliation comes first. It was all over his face now. Monica watched him absorb it without offering relief. When she finally spoke, her voice was level enough to make the moment feel colder. Take the cuff off. No raised tone. No anger. No emphasis. Just instruction. And now, for the first time all night, Pike understood what authority sounded like when it didn't need volume. He didn't move. Not immediately. That hesitation was not confusion. It was the last reflex of ego trying to survive public collapse. Monica's eyes stayed on him. Now. One word. No force behind it. None needed. Pike reached for the cuff. His hands, steady through the entire stop, were not steady now. The key caught once. Missed. Caught again. Clicked. The cuff released. Metal fell away from Monica's wrist. That sound changed the entire shape of the street. Because the moment the cuff opened, everything Pike had been pretending this was disappeared with it. No arrest. No resistance. No dangerous rider. Just an unlawful stop, a public misuse of force, and one very visible federal credential. Monica stepped forward and took her hand back without haste. No dramatic motion. No visible anger. Just ownership of her space returning in one clean movement. She rubbed her wrist once where the metal had bitten skin, then took the credential wallet from Holloway's hand and slid it back into her jacket. Controlled. Measured. Complete. Pike opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because apologies require footing, and he no longer had any. Holloway stood still, pulse hammering, suddenly aware that the next words spoken on that roadside would determine whether this became salvageable misconduct or career-ending stupidity. Pike tried again. Agent Reed, I. Monica cut him off without raising her voice. No. The word landed harder than shouting would have. Pike stopped. Monica adjusted the cuff mark on her sleeve, then looked directly at him. You do not get to recover this with tone. Holloway felt the sentence hit Pike like impact. Because it stripped away the one tool he had been relying on all night. Control of framing. Monica continued, calm and surgical. You initiated a stop without articulable cause. Pike said nothing. You escalated a routine interaction into physical detention. Nothing. You used force before establishing legal grounds. The passing traffic suddenly felt louder. You applied restraints without probable cause. Each sentence landed like documentation. Not anger. Record. Monica took one step closer. Not aggressive. Precise. And you attempted to narrate compliance as resistance in front of civilian witnesses. Pike's face tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? Everything she was saying was already true before she finished saying it. Holloway understood what was happening now. She wasn't confronting him. She was preserving sequence, establishing the timeline exactly as it would later need to exist. And Pike knew it too. That was why he looked like he was trying not to breathe too hard. Monica turned her eyes to Holloway. Not soft, not warm, but clear. You verified before this became irreversible. Holloway didn't answer. Didn't trust his voice enough to. Monica gave one small nod. Acknowledgement. Nothing more. Then she looked back at Pike. And when she spoke again, her tone was somehow even calmer. Call your supervisor. No anger. No threat. Just inevitability. And for the first time all night, Pike understood the stop was no longer his. Have you ever seen a man realize the moment he loses control is not when someone fights him, but when someone removes his ability to define what happened? That was the moment Daniel Pike stopped being the officer in charge of the stop. Not when the badge came out. Not when the cuff came off. When Monica Reed told him to call his supervisor and he understood, with humiliating clarity, that he was no longer the one setting the order of what came next. For the first time that night, Pike looked like a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty. The cruiser lights still flashed across the pavement in red and blue pulses. Traffic still drifted by. A cluster of bystanders had formed just far enough away to pretend they weren't watching while watching everything. The city had not paused for his mistake. It had simply become witness to it. 28:04, 9:51 a.m. Moawas Naim. Pike stood motionless for one long second, jaw tight, eyes flicking once toward Holloway as if searching for some last remaining version of the night where this could still be contained. There wasn't one. Monica stood beside the bike, one wrist marked red where the cuff had bitten skin, helmet resting on the seat, posture calm enough to make the entire stop look even worse in hindsight. She was not angry in the way Pike understood anger. She was not loud. She was not emotional. She had become something much more dangerous to men like him. Precise. And precision leaves very little room to hide. Call your supervisor, she repeated. Pike swallowed. His hand went to the radio slower than it should have. That hesitation was all anyone needed to see. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Reluctance. The final reflex of a man who understood that every second before the call was the last second. This still belonged only to the three people standing in it. He keyed the radio. His voice, when it came, was flatter than before. Not calm. Controlled in the brittle way men sound when they are trying to keep their embarrassment from becoming audible. Unit 12 requesting field supervisor. Dispatch answered immediately, casual and routine, unaware that the tone of the response no longer matched the stop. Supervisor requested. Status. Pike hesitated. 1 second too long. Holloway heard it. Monica heard it. Dispatch heard it too. Unit 12, status. Pike looked at Monica, then away. Need supervisor on scene. That was all he said. Not because it was enough. Because anything more risked saying too much on an open channel. Dispatch came back a beat later. Copy. Field supervisor en route. And just like that, the stop changed jurisdiction. Not legally. Psychologically. Because once a supervisor is called to scene after cuffs have already come off, every officer present knows the same thing. The narrative has failed. Pike lowered the radio. Said nothing. Monica let the silence sit. That silence did more damage than accusation. Because now he had to stand in it. No commands left to give. No leverage left to use. No version of authority left except the one he could still perform in front of bystanders and his junior partner, and both had already seen too much. Holloway shifted his weight and finally stepped half a pace away from Pike. Small movement, but not small in meaning. Distance is its own statement when authority collapses. Pike noticed. His eyes cut toward Holloway, sharp and brief. A warning reflex. Too late. Holloway did not move back. That was the first visible fracture between them. Monica saw it immediately. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The stop was doing its own work now. A woman near the convenience store had her phone half raised, pretending to check something on the screen while clearly filming. A man in a delivery jacket stood beside the window, not subtle at all. Two people in a sedan at the light had not moved even after it turned green. Witnesses were no longer incidental. They were part of the scene. Pike saw them too, and for the first time, the weight of visibility hit him fully. Not just what had happened. Who had seen it happen? That was when fear finally arrived. Not fear of Monica. Fear of permanence. Monica reached into her jacket slowly and withdrew her phone. No sudden movements. No performance. She looked at the screen once, then lifted her eyes to Pike. "I'm documenting the remainder of this interaction. Not a threat. Not a warning. A procedural courtesy." Pike said nothing. What could he say? Object now, and it becomes retaliation. Allow it, and it becomes record. He had run out of favorable options 10 minutes ago. Holloway exhaled once, slow. The adrenaline was changing now. No longer the hot rush of roadside escalation. Something colder. Awareness. He replayed the stop in fragments. The lights. The commands. The wrist grab. The word resisting. The cuff. The badge. And beneath all of it, the simple truth becoming impossible to ignore. None of this had needed to happen. That was the part he could not stop hearing. Not the legal risk. Not the federal credential. The preventable stupidity of it. Monica looked at Holloway once more. When she spoke, her tone had softened by less than a degree. "Your body cam is active." Holloway nodded immediately. "Yes. Good." One word, but it hit harder than relief. Because what she had just confirmed was not evidence against Pike. It was evidence against the version of the night Pike might still try to invent. A siren sounded in the distance. Short. Approaching. Supervisor. Pike heard it and straightened instinctively, old habits reaching for shape even now. But posture was useless now. The next officer arriving would not be responding to a stop. He would be arriving at a scene already defined by failure. And everyone standing under the red and blue wash of Unit 12 knew it. Have you ever watched someone prepare to explain themselves before they even know which version of the truth they're about to be asked for? That was Daniel Pike when the supervisor's cruiser turned onto the shoulder. The vehicle pulled in behind Unit 12, lights flashing once before settling into a steady wash across the roadside. Gravel shifted beneath the tires. The engine cut. The driver's door opened. Sergeant Lena Alvarez stepped out. 40s. Compact build. Controlled posture. The kind of command presence that never needed volume because it had long since stopped asking rooms for permission. She took in the scene in one sweep before the door fully shut behind her. Patrol unit. Traffic stop. Public shoulder. One civilian motorcycle. One rider standing. One officer rigid. One officer quiet. One visible cuff mark. And the shape of the situation revealed itself instantly. Not in detail. In imbalance. She had been doing this too long to need the report before reading the posture. What happened? No greeting. No wasted tone. Just the question. Pike answered too fast. Routine traffic stop escalated. Alvarez lifted one hand. He stopped. Not because she raised her voice. Because she didn't. That was the first difference between authority and control, and everyone on that roadside felt it. Alvarez looked at Holloway. Not Pike. Start over. The silence that followed lasted less than a second, but it changed everything. Because Pike understood immediately what had just happened. He was no longer being treated as the primary narrator. Holloway felt it too, and for one brief moment, he saw the decision in front of him with brutal clarity. Protect Pike, or preserve the truth. He glanced once at Monica. She said nothing, didn't need to. The answer was already standing there in one cuff mark and a federal badge tucked back inside a leather jacket. Holloway inhaled, then spoke. Traffic stop initiated for alleged aggressive lane movement, he said. No active flags on registration. Rider complied immediately. Engine off. Hands visible. Alvarez's eyes stayed on him. No interruption. No reaction. Just listening. Holloway continued. Driver requested reason for stop. Verbal exchange escalated. Officer Pike initiated physical contact prior to establishing probable cause. Pike's head turned sharply. Trent. Alvarez raised one finger without looking at him. Silence. Pike obeyed it, not willingly, but visibly. That alone told Monica almost everything she needed to know about how this would unfold. Holloway kept going. One cuff was applied during attempted detention. Subject identified herself as Special Agent Monica Reed, FBI, off-duty. Credentials verified on scene. Cuff removed immediately after verification. He stopped. Alvarez let the silence hold for one breath. Then turned to Monica. Special Agent Reed. Monica gave one controlled nod. Yes. Alvarez's eyes dropped once to the red mark on Monica's wrist. Then rose again. Were you informed of the basis for detention prior to physical contact? Monica answered without embellishment. No. Were you resisting? No. Did you identify yourself before the cuff was applied? No. I identified after unlawful escalation began. Simple. Clean. Exact. Alvarez absorbed all three answers without changing expression. That was the second difference between authority and performance. Real authority does not react first. It processes. She turned, finally, to Pike. And for the first time since she arrived, she looked directly at him. Did you establish probable cause before initiating physical detention? Pike hesitated. That was all the answer anyone needed. But Alvarez waited, because silence, in the hands of competent authority, is not emptiness. It is pressure. Pike tried anyway. She was non-compliant. Monica said nothing. Holloway said nothing. Alvarez held Pike's stare. How? Pike opened his mouth, closed it, because for the first time all night, he was being asked to produce sequence instead of tone. And sequence was where his version of events died. She questioned the stop, he said. Finally. Alvarez didn't blink. That is not non-compliance. The sentence landed flat and fatal. No volume. No heat. Just fact. Pike felt it. Everyone did. Alvarez took one step closer. Did she fail to stop? No. Did she fail to obey initial instruction? No. Did she make threatening movement? No. Each answer stripped another layer off the story Pike had been trying to survive inside. Did she attempt to flee? No. Did she strike you? No. The city noise felt distant now. Traffic still moved. People still watched. But the stop had become something quieter and far more devastating. Structured. Alvarez gave a single nod. Not approval. Recognition. Then she said the sentence Pike had spent the last 10 minutes trying to outrun. Then articulate the legal basis for cuffing her. Pike said nothing, because there wasn't one, and for the first time that night, the silence belonged entirely to him. Have you ever seen a person run out of room to lie while standing perfectly still? That was Daniel Pike in the silence after Sergeant Alvarez asked the only question that mattered. Articulate the legal basis for cuffing her. There are moments in authority where words stop being tools and become evidence. Pike knew that. Every officer does. It is one of the first things training teaches and one of the first things ego convinces bad officers they can outrun. He had outrun it for years. Not tonight. Because there was no wording left that could save sequence. No phrasing broad enough to cover what had already happened. No report language soft enough to disguise what every person on that roadside now understood with painful clarity. He had put cuffs on a compliant woman because she had remained calm long enough to expose how fast he had stopped acting like a professional. And now he had to answer for it in front of a supervisor, his partner, civilian witnesses, and the woman he had tried to define before he understood who she was. Pike swallowed once. Nothing came out. Sergeant Alvarez watched him in total silence. No impatience. No visible judgment. Just pressure. It was the kind of silence competent supervisors use when they already know the answer and are measuring whether the officer in front of them is about to make this salvageable or terminal. Pike tried anyway. She became argumentative. Alvarez didn't blink. That is not probable cause. The words landed instantly. Clean. Final. Uncompromising. Pike's jaw tightened. He tried again, smaller this time. She challenged lawful instruction. Alvarez answered just as fast. Questioning a stop is not resisting detention. Another door closed. Pike looked toward Holloway. Then toward the road. Then anywhere but directly at the reality in front of him. He was searching now, not for facts, but for cover. There was none. Because every path led back to the same point. She stopped. She complied. He escalated. Monica stood beside the bike, one hand resting lightly on the seat, posture calm, face unreadable. She had not interrupted once. Had not embellished. Had not raised her voice. She had become the most dangerous kind of witness possible. Disciplined. No anger to discredit. No theatrics to dismiss. No emotion to recast as instability. Just sequence. Alvarez shifted her attention to Holloway. Body cam confirmed. Yes, Sergeant. Active from initial stop. Yes. That answer changed Pike's face more than anything else had. Not because he had forgotten the camera. Because until now, some part of him had still been hoping ambiguity might survive memory. Body cam kills memory. It replaces recollection with sequence. Monica saw the realization hit him. So did Alvarez. Good, Alvarez said. One word, no emphasis. But everyone standing there understood what it meant. This was no longer a matter of conflicting accounts. Now it was only a matter of review. Alvarez turned to Monica again. Special Agent Reed, were you injured? Monica glanced once at the reddening mark on her wrist. No lasting injury. Alvarez's eyes moved briefly to the bike where Monica had been driven into it. Were you shoved into the vehicle? Monica answered without hesitation. Yes. Pike moved immediately. She pulled away. Enough. Alvarez didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. The word cut him off so completely even traffic noise seemed to pull back around it. Pike stopped speaking, and for the first time all night, he looked less angry than cornered. Alvarez turned fully toward him now. Not as a supervisor managing a scene. As a superior officer documenting one. Officer Pike, step back from the stop. The sentence landed with a kind of quiet violence only cops fully understand. Not a request. Not a pause. Removal. Pike stared at her. For half a second, disbelief flashed across his face, brief, involuntary, humiliating. Because this was the moment the demotion of authority became visible. Not formal, not written, but public. Sergeant, step back. Still calm, still flat, still absolute. Pike hesitated one beat too long. Then stepped back. It was only 2 paces. But those 2 paces changed everything. He was no longer controlling contact. No longer primary. No longer even standing inside the center of the interaction he had created. And every witness on that roadside saw it happen. Monica saw it. Holloway saw it. Pike saw them seeing it. That was the part that hurt him most. Alvarez let the silence settle before speaking again. Officer Holloway, you're primary now. Holloway nodded once. The shift was immediate, procedural, clean, no ceremony. Just authority moving where competence still remained. Pike said nothing, but something in him changed visibly in that moment. Not remorse, not yet, something colder. The dawning understanding that the stop was no longer just going badly. It was now moving forward without him. Alvarez faced Monica. Special Agent Reed, I'm going to ask one question, and I'd like a direct answer. Monica nodded. Do you intend to file formal complaint? The roadside went still. Even Pike looked up. Because that was the real question now. Not what happened next. Monica didn't answer immediately. And that small pause did something far more powerful than any immediate reaction could have. It forced everyone there to sit inside consequence for just a few seconds longer. The wind moved lightly across the roadside. A passing car slowed, then sped up again. The city continued its indifferent rhythm, but within the circle of flashing lights, nothing felt normal anymore. Monica looked down at her wrist once. The faint mark where the cuff had been. Not dramatic, not severe, but visible enough to be real. Then she looked back up at Sergeant Alvarez. Her voice stayed calm. Yes, one word. No anger attached to it. No hesitation. Just confirmation. That single response shifted the atmosphere again, subtle but irreversible. Pike felt it first, because he understood exactly what, Yes, meant in that context. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't revenge. It was process. And process, when it begins at this level, does not stop at explanation. Alvarez gave a slow nod, absorbing the answer without reaction. Understood. She turned slightly, eyes moving between Holloway and Pike. Secure your reports exactly as they occurred. No interpretation. No filler language. Her gaze landed briefly on Pike. Sequence matters. That sentence hit harder than any reprimand. Because Pike knew what it meant. Sequence was the one thing he could not rewrite anymore. Monica stepped slightly away from the bike, finally breaking her static posture for the first time since the cuff came off. Not retreating, not leaving, just repositioning herself out of immediate contact range. She adjusted her jacket cuff over her wrist. No performance, just closure. Holloway stood quietly now, feeling the weight of responsibility settle fully onto him. He wasn't thinking about blame anymore. He was thinking about accuracy. About getting every detail exactly right before memory and panic tried to distort it later. Pike, however, was still standing in a different kind of silence. Not acceptance. Containment. The kind people enter when they realize reacting further will only expand damage. But inside him, something was shifting. Slowly. Not outwardly visible yet, but building. Alvarez spoke again, her tone steady but final. This stop is concluded. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they deepened the tension. Because, concluded, in a situation like this doesn't mean finished. It means transferred. To paperwork. To review. To accountability. To consequences that no longer need the officers present to continue existing. Monica looked once toward Holloway. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Just acknowledgement. He gave a small nod back, barely noticeable, but real. A silent recognition of what had almost gone worse than it did. Then Monica spoke again. Sergeant. Alvarez looked at her. Monica's voice remained controlled. I will be submitting full incident documentation through federal channels. Pike exhaled through his nose, a short, involuntary sound. Not laughter. Not sarcasm. Something tighter. Alvarez didn't react to it. She simply replied, "That is your right." No resistance. No defense. Just acceptance of process. That, more than anything, confirmed the direction this had already taken. Alvarez turned slightly toward Pike. Officer Pike. He straightened instinctively. Not fully. But enough. Yes, Sergeant. A pause. Then Alvarez spoke carefully. You will be relieved from active patrol pending review of this incident. The words hit like a quiet shutdown. No yelling. No confrontation. Just removal from operational status. Pike's face tightened. But he said nothing. Because anything he said now would only deepen the record already forming. Alvarez continued. You will submit your statement in writing. Body cam will be reviewed in full. Another pause. And you will not contact the subject outside of formal process. That final line made everything real. Because it removed the possibility of informal correction. No apology that could reset it. No conversation that could soften it. Only structure now. Pike nodded once. But it wasn't agreement. It was recognition. Monica watched him carefully. Not with satisfaction. Not with emotion. But with something quieter. Observation. The kind professionals use when they've already learned what they needed from a moment and are now simply confirming the rest will unfold as expected. The silence returned again, but this time it wasn't tense in the same way. It was finalizing, a closure forming around something that had already finished happening emotionally, even if the formal processes had just begun. A distant siren passed somewhere far down the road. Life continuing, unaware or uninterested. Alvarez took one last look across the scene. Then spoke calmly. Everyone is dismissed from active interaction. A beat. This matter is now administrative. And with that, the street returned to motion around them. But none of them returned with it in. The same way they had arrived. Have you ever noticed how the real consequences of a moment don't happen when it ends, but when people start replaying it in their heads afterward? That was where the silence took Pike. Not on the roadside, not in front of Alvarez, not even when he was formally pulled from active duty. It was later, much later, when the lights were gone, the witnesses dispersed, and the city went back to pretending it had never stopped to watch him unravel. But the memory stayed, and it didn't stay as a single event. It stayed as fragments. The sound of the cuff clicking shut. Monica's voice saying *FBI without raising her tone. The moment Holloway's face changed when he saw the credential. Sergeant Alvarez's expression that never once suggested uncertainty. And worse than all of it, the realization that not a single part of the stop had actually supported his original judgment. That was what replayed the loudest. Pike sat alone in the precinct processing room, uniform partially unzipped, elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing that could be called focus. His report form was open, cursor blinking, waiting, but writing felt impossible, because writing requires structure, and structure requires truth that can survive being placed in order. He tried anyway. Vehicle observed traveling. He stopped, deleted it, because even that opening felt dishonest now. Not because the bike hadn't been moving, but because movement had never been the issue. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. For the first time since the stop, there was no one to perform authority in front of. No partner, no supervisor, no public, only the aftershock, and in that space, ego no longer had witnesses to feed it. Which meant something else finally surfaced. Clarity. Unwanted, uncomfortable, unavoidable. He replayed Monica's posture again. Not aggressive, not fearful, controlled, professional controlled, not the kind of control civilians fake when trying to look calm. The kind trained people develop when they know exactly how far escalation can go before it becomes irreversible. And Pike had stepped across that line without even recognizing it. His jaw tightened. He tried to find the version of events where he was still justified. Still reasonable. Still operating within something defensible. But every version collapsed under the same simple sequence. No probable cause. No threat. No resistance. No justification for force, only escalation. He pushed the chair back suddenly, frustration breaking through the silence. The sound echoed too loudly in the room. He stood and paced once. Then stopped, because pacing didn't fix anything. It just made him feel like he was still in control of movement. But control of movement was not what was gone. Control of narrative was. And he understood, finally, what Holloway had understood on the roadside before he did. This wasn't a situation that could be argued into neutrality. It was already recorded, already witnessed, already structured, already defined. He sat back down slowly, ran a hand over his face, and for the first time, the thought arrived fully formed instead of resisted. I shouldn't have touched her. Asterisk, not as regret. As fact, the realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt late, far too late. Across town, Monica Reed stood in a quiet office space, jacket off, wrist resting on a desk as she filled out her own documentation with steady precision. No rush, no anger in her movements. Just accuracy. Every detail mattered, not because she wanted escalation, because she understood how quickly moments like that were rewritten if they weren't captured correctly. She paused once, not in emotion, in memory. The moment the cuff went on. Not fear, not shock, just the calculation of how fast assumption can override reality when authority stops checking itself. Then she continued writing. Back at the precinct, Holloway reviewed his own body cam feed in silence. He didn't speak. Didn't react outwardly, just watched, and as the footage played, the same pattern became unavoidable to him too. Not chaos, not confusion, sequence, clear, uninterrupted sequence of escalation that never needed to happen. He stopped the playback once, paused on Pike's hand reaching for the cuff, then leaned back slightly, Because there are moments in this job where you don't just review what happened. You review who you were while it was happening. And that was the part no training fully prepares you for. Outside, the city kept moving like nothing had changed. But for everyone involved in that stop, something already had. And it wouldn't be forgotten by any of them. Have you ever noticed how the aftermath of a single mistake doesn't end when everyone goes home? It begins when silence finally has room to speak. That was the kind of silence Pike couldn't escape. Not the loud kind of consequences. Not immediate termination. Not courtroom drama. Something slower, colder, more suffocating. The kind that lives inside every pause before your name is called in a hallway. Inside every glance that lasts half a second too long. Inside every conversation that suddenly ends when you enter the room. The official report had already started its life without him. That was the part no one tells you about early enough. Once an incident becomes documented, it stops belonging to memory and starts belonging to structure. And structure does not care how you feel about it. It only cares what can be proven. Pike sat in his locker room long after his shift technically ended, uniform half folded, hands resting loosely together like they were waiting for instructions he no longer had the authority to give himself. His locker door was open. Inside it, everything looked the same as it had yesterday. But nothing felt the same anymore. The badge, the gear, the name printed on his equipment. All of it now felt like it belonged to someone who had made decisions under a different reality. A reality where consequences were always delayed. Where authority always filled in the blanks. Where questions were something other people asked after the fact. That version of reality had ended on the roadside. He exhaled slowly. Not because he was calm. Because he was trying to slow the thoughts that wouldn't stop arriving in sequence. Monica Reed. FBI. The cuff. The command to step back. Alvarez's voice cutting through him without raising volume. And Holloway. Holloway not backing him. That part lingered longer than the rest. Because betrayal, even quiet betrayal, always feels personal to people who are used to being followed. Pike stood up suddenly, walked to the sink, turned on the water, watched it run. He wasn't thinking about washing anything. He was thinking about resetting something that couldn't be reset. In another part of the precinct, Alvarez sat alone at her desk reviewing initial notes. Not emotional, not rushed, methodical. She had seen stops like this before. Not identical, but familiar in structure. What concerned her wasn't the incident itself anymore. It was how easily it had escalated without correction from the officer in control. That pattern always mattered more than the moment. Because moments could be mistakes. Patterns were decisions. She paused once in her notes and wrote a single line. Escalation initiated without proportional trigger. Asterisk. Then she underlined it once. Not for emphasis. For clarity. Across from her, Holloway submitted his preliminary statement. Clean. Unembellished. Accurate. And that was the hardest part for him. Because accuracy, in situations like this, doesn't allow loyalty to soften impact. It only allows truth to stand in its exact shape. Monica's statement arrived electronically shortly after. Structured, formal, precise to the point of discomfort. No emotion embedded in language. Just timeline, sequence, action, response, impact. It read like something designed not to accuse, but to withstand scrutiny. Which is why it would. Later that night, Pike finally left the precinct. The parking lot was mostly empty. The air felt colder than it should have for the time of day. He walked to his car slowly. Not because he was tired. Because urgency no longer had direction. Halfway there, he stopped. Just stood still for a moment under the parking lot light. And for the first time since the stop, the question he had avoided all day finally formed fully in his mind without resistance. Not how did this happen? Asterisk. That answer was already clear. The question was worse. How did I not see it happening while I was doing it? Asterisk. There was no answer. Only silence. And in that silence, something else began to form. Not punishment yet, not resolution, but recognition. That some mistakes don't explode. They accumulate. And by the time you realize what they've become, they are already larger than the moment that created them. Behind him, the precinct lights continued to glow steadily. Unchanged, indifferent, and completely unconcerned with how differently every person inside it would now move through the days ahead. Have you ever noticed how some consequences don't arrive like a storm, but like paperwork that slowly tightens around your life until you realize you can't breathe the same way anymore? That was the phase Pike entered 2 days later. It didn't begin with a confrontation. It began with a notification. A formal review notice. Standard language. Non-emotional. The kind of document that looks harmless until you understand it is not describing what might happen, it is describing what is already in motion. By the time he read it fully, he already knew the decision had been made somewhere above him, and what remained was only the procedural path it would take. Administrative leave pending investigation, mandatory interview, full body cam audit, supervisor statement reconciliation, external agency notification acknowledged. Each line felt colder than the last, not because it was aggressive, but because it was final in a way that didn't require explanation. He sat at his kitchen table staring at the page for a long time. Not moving, not reacting, just reading it again as if repetition might soften meaning. It didn't. Some truths become heavier every time you re-encounter them. His phone buzzed once, then again. He didn't look at it immediately, because he already knew who it would be. Eventually he did. 2 missed calls. 1 internal affairs contact message. 1 from Holloway. That one made his jaw tighten. Not anger this time. Something more complicated. Because Holloway wasn't supposed to be the one reaching out first. Pike didn't call back. Instead, he sat there trying to reconstruct the stop again in his mind. Not the emotional version, not the defensive version, but the raw sequence stripped of justification. Bike observed. Stop initiated. Interaction escalated. Cuff applied. Credential revealed. Cuff removed. Supervisor arrived. And nowhere in that sequence was there a moment where escalation had been necessary. That was the part he kept circling back to. Not what went wrong, but what was never actually right to begin with. Across town, Monica Reed stood in a federal facility conference room, speaking with 2 internal reviewers. Not about emotion, about sequence, about procedure adherence, about threshold for force application. Her tone remained unchanged throughout. Controlled, precise. 28:04, 9:52 a.m. Moawaz Naeem. Professional in the way that made everything she said difficult to challenge because nothing she said depended on interpretation. When asked whether she felt the situation escalated due to misunderstanding or bias, she paused only briefly. Then answered, escalation occurred without legal threshold being met. No additional commentary. No expansion. Just fact. One of the reviewers nodded and made a note. That was the end of it from her side. Not emotionally, but procedurally. Later that afternoon, Holloway stood in a nearly empty briefing room reviewing still frames from the body cam footage. He paused it at the moment Pike first reached for Monica's arm. Zoomed slightly, then stopped again. He had replayed it enough times now that he no longer saw motion. Only decisions, each one stacking on the next like steps down a staircase no one had bothered to check the end of. A senior officer entered the room quietly behind him. You're reviewing it again. Holloway didn't look away from the screen. Yes. A pause. You could have backed him harder, the officer said. Holloway finally looked up. Not defensive. Just honest. No, he said. I couldn't. That was all. And strangely, it was enough. Because everyone who understood the footage already understood why. Back at Pike's home, the silence had shifted. It was no longer just internal. It had started to externalize. A missed shift briefing, a second missed call from Ia. A message from his unit group chat that stopped halfway through forming sympathy and never continued. Not hostility, Just distance. And distance, in professions built on trust, is its own kind of sentence. Pike stood by his window that night watching traffic move outside. Normal world. Unaware world. A world where most people would never know what had happened on that roadside beyond a headline shape or a rumor fragment. But he knew. And worse, so did the system that would now measure every part of it. He closed the blinds slowly. Not out of avoidance. Out of instinct. As if reducing visibility could somehow reduce consequence. It couldn't. And somewhere, in another part of the city, Monica Reed finished her report, closed her file, and stepped out into a night that had already moved on from the moment she was forced to stand still in it. Because in situations like this, justice doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a process that has only just started learning your name. Have you ever noticed how the final stage of a situation like this isn't loud at all? It's quiet, almost disappointingly normal. That was how Pike learned what, under review, actually meant in practice. Not sirens, not immediate termination, not dramatic confrontation, just distance. Structured, professional distance that slowly removes you from every place you used to belong without ever needing to raise its voice. 2 more days passed, then 3, then a week, and during that time, Pike stopped receiving the small signals that used to define his identity inside the department. No shift assignments, no casual check-ins, no informal messages about unit rotation or patrol coverage. Even the silence felt organized now, like it had been scheduled. Inside that silence, Pike replayed the stop less emotionally and more clinically. Not because he had accepted it, but because he was trying to understand where exactly the structure broke. Not the emotion, not the embarrassment, the structure. He kept returning to the same point. The moment the rider removed her helmet. Because that was where certainty had first started to fail. Not because of what she said, but because of how little it changed her behavior. Most people, in his experience, reacted to escalation in predictable ways. Confusion, fear, defensiveness, negotiation. Monica Reed had done none of that. And that absence now looked different in hindsight. Not suspicious, professional. That was the word that kept resurfacing against his will. Professional. The kind of composure trained, not performed. The kind of control that does not rely on how others perceive it. It was the first time Pike started thinking about the stop in terms that didn't center him. And that realization was more uncomfortable than the investigation itself. Because it meant there was a version of events where he had not simply made a mistake, but failed to recognize competence in front of him. Across the city, Holloway was called in again. This time not for explanation. For clarification. There is a difference. Explanation is defensive. Clarification is structural. He sat across from an internal review officer who did not look at him for emotion, only consistency. You stated Officer Pike initiated physical contact prior to establishment of probable cause. Yes. Was there any verbal resistance prior to contact? No. Did the subject comply with initial instruction to stop? Yes. Did the subject attempt to flee at any point? No. Each answer narrowed the space around the incident further, until there was almost nothing left except the core sequence. And once sequence is isolated, interpretation becomes unnecessary. After the interview, Holloway sat alone in the hallway for a while. Not because he was in trouble, but because he had fully understood something that would not leave him. That the stop had been simple. Until it wasn't. And it stopped becoming complicated at the exact moment someone chose escalation instead of confirmation. Later that evening, Monica Reed stood in a different building entirely, reviewing the finalized internal acknowledgement of the incident. No emotional language attached, just findings. Improper escalation confirmed. Procedural deviation noted. Force application unsupported by documented threshold. Bodycam corroboration complete. She read it once, then closed the file, not because it was finished emotionally, but because it was finished structurally. Outside, life continued at its usual speed. People walked, cars moved, phones rang, messages were sent and ignored. But for Pike, the world had narrowed. Not dramatically, gradually, like a door closing over time instead of all at once. He sat at home that night with the television on without watching it. The sound filled the room just enough to prevent total silence, but not enough to matter. His phone remained face down on the table. He didn't need to look at it anymore to know what it contained. Updates, delays, formalities, processes moving forward without requiring his participation. And somewhere inside all of that, something else was forming. Not resolution, not redemption, just understanding, unwanted, uncomfortable, delayed, that the stop was never about control. It was about recognition, and the moment recognition failed, everything else followed with it. The screen flickered in the background, unimportant, unnoticed, and the night moved forward without asking him whether he was ready to move with it. Have you ever noticed how the final consequence of a bad decision doesn't arrive like punishment, it arrives like confirmation? That was the stage Pike entered when the official review concluded. Not announced loudly, not dramatically, just finalized. A document uploaded, a signature applied, a decision locked into administrative permanence. And suddenly, what had been under investigation became something much heavier. Findings confirmed. Pike read the notice in silence, standing in his kitchen again, the same place where he had first tried to convince himself there was still a version of events that could be shaped in his favor. There wasn't. The language was precise, unemotional, almost indifferent, but that indifference made it worse. Because it removed argument entirely. The findings were not written as opinion. They were written as record. Improper escalation confirmed. Use of force not supported by articulable legal threshold. Detention without probable cause established. Failure in procedural de-escalation. Each line felt like a door closing quietly behind him. No slam, no shockwave, just finality moving step by step until there was nowhere left to step back into. He lowered the paper slowly. And for a moment, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel injustice. He felt something more difficult to process. Stillness. The kind that arrives when the system you operate inside finally reflects your actions back at you without interpretation. Across the city, Holloway received the same notification in a different form. Cleared of misconduct, noted for procedural compliance under escalation conditions. He read it once, then sat back. Relief should have followed, but what he felt instead was weight. Because clearance did not erase the memory of watching it happen. It only confirmed he had seen it correctly while it was unfolding. And that meant the moment would stay with him longer than any paperwork ever would. Monica Reed, meanwhile, received her final confirmation in a sealed briefing summary. No escalation recommended, no procedural deviation on her part. Case closed from federal perspective. But she did not linger on it. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was already over for her the moment the cuff came off. What remained was not closure. Just documentation. Back in Pike's world, the department conversation finally arrived. Not in public, not in confrontation, in quiet administrative phrasing that carried more finality than any shouting ever could. Reassignment pending. Operational review complete. Temporary restriction of field authority effective immediately. Pike sat in the same chair where he had once filled out his report, now long abandoned. The blank screen in front of him felt different than before. Not waiting. Finished. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, staring at nothing in particular. And for the first time, he stopped trying to reconstruct the stop as something defendable. Instead, he saw it as it had actually been. A sequence that began with assumption, moved through escalation, and ended in confirmation that none of it had been necessary. The part that stayed with him most was not the cuff, not the badge, not the supervisor's arrival. It was the absence of any moment where he had been correct. Not even briefly, not even accidentally. That realization did not come with emotion. It came with structure. Clean, undeniable, and irreversible in memory. Outside, the world kept moving without acknowledgement. Cars passed. Lights changed. People argued over things that felt important in real time but would not matter the next day. And inside that ordinary motion, three people carried the same event forward in completely different ways. One is consequence, one is confirmation, one is understanding, but none of them carried it as nothing. Because some moments do not disappear. They simply change form, and once they do, they stay present long after the street goes dark. Have you ever noticed how the hardest part of accountability isn't what happens to you, it's what you have to live with after everything has already stopped happening? That was where Pike ended up. Not in chaos, not in conflict, in aftermath. Days had turned into a quiet rhythm of waiting for assignments that didn't come, waiting for calls that used to arrive without question, waiting for a version of his professional identity that no longer answered back the same way. He sat in his car one afternoon outside the precinct parking lot and didn't get out immediately. Not because he was avoiding work, because he wasn't sure what work meant for him anymore. The building still looked the same. People still entered and exited. Uniforms still moved with purpose. But for Pike, it no longer felt like a place he belonged to. It felt like a place he had already been separated from, even if the paperwork had only recently caught up. Inside, the incident had already become something else. Not a conversation, a reference point, something supervisors used without emotion when explaining procedural boundaries to newer officers. A case study in escalation without threshold. A reminder of how quickly confidence can outrun legality. And how slowly reality corrects it afterward. Holloway had returned to regular duty, but something in him had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, in small ways. The way he paused before certain stops now. The way he asked more questions before accepting interpretations. The way he no longer treated silence from a civilian as something automatically suspicious. He hadn't become softer. He had become slower to assume. And that difference mattered more than he expected. One evening, he stood in the briefing room listening to a senior instructor speak to new recruits about control under uncertainty. The instructor used language Holloway recognized immediately now. Threshold, articulation, sequence, probable cause, not as abstract terms, as living boundaries. And for the first time, he understood what those words were really meant to prevent. Not crime, error under authority. After the session, Holloway remained seated for a while, watching the empty chairs in front of him. He thought about Pike, not with anger anymore, not with judgment, with something more complicated, understanding mixed with distance, because he had seen how fast confidence can become assumption, and how assumption, once reinforced by rank or routine, becomes difficult to interrupt from the inside. Monica Reed had already moved on in a way only people with structured professions can. Not emotionally detached, but forward-oriented. The incident existed in her records now, but not in her daily focus. What remained with her was not the confrontation itself. It was the confirmation of how quickly systems can misread composure when they are not calibrated to recognize it. She had seen it before in different forms. This one had just been more visible, more public, more unnecessary, and that was what made it worth documenting. Not for her, but for what it revealed. One evening, she reviewed her final case notes once more before archiving them. Not because she needed to revisit them, but because closure in her world required a final structural pass. Everything aligned, everything supported, everything complete. She closed the file. And it was done. Back in Pike's world, the administrative status finally transitioned again. Not dramatically, just quietly updated. Extended restriction, pending further evaluation of field suitability. A phrase that did not end careers, but suspended direction. Pike read it without reaction at first, because at this point, reaction felt unnecessary. What changed instead was something internal. Not acceptance, not resignation, something closer to clarity forming where denial had been. He understood now that the stop had not been a single mistake. It had been a chain. And at any point in that chain, it could have been corrected by slowing down instead of accelerating. But it hadn't been. Not once. That was the part that stayed with him most. Not the outcome, the absence of interruption. He stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the street was normal again. Unaware, unbothered, continuing exactly as it always had. And for the first time since the night of the stop, Pike didn't replay it as defense. He replayed it as structure. And structure, once understood clearly enough, does not allow illusions to survive inside it. Have you ever noticed how some endings don't feel like endings at all? Just a quiet shift where life continues, but you don't continue in the same place within it. That was where Pike found himself weeks later. Not erased, not forgotten, just displaced. The investigation was no longer active in daily conversation. The paperwork had done its job. The systems had moved on to other incidents, other names, other sequences of events that now deserved attention. But Pike remained in the afterspace. The part no report ever fully captures. He sat in a small office that no longer felt like his, going through reassignment documentation with the kind of attention people give to things they cannot change but are still required to understand. Training refresh, operational review continuation, field eligibility suspended pending psychological and procedural reassessment. The words were clean, almost polite, but their meaning was not. It wasn't punishment in the dramatic sense. It was removal of certainty. And for someone like Pike, that was worse. Across town, Holloway had already been reassigned to a different unit rotation. New partner, new routes, new routines, but not a new memory. That part stayed unchanged. He noticed it most during quiet moments. The pauses before stops, the way he now listened longer before interpreting, the way he no longer rushed to fill silence with assumption. It didn't make him hesitant. It made him aware, and awareness, once gained, does not fade easily. One evening after shift, he sat in his car longer than usual before heading home. Engine off, hands resting on the wheel. Not thinking about the day's calls. Thinking about that night, not the outcome, the sequence, because sequence was what mattered now. Not who was right, but what happened first, and what happened next. And what could have changed everything in between. Monica Reed, meanwhile, had already been reassigned to another federal case cycle. Her file on the incident had been fully archived, but she had made one final internal note before closing it completely. Escalation occurred due to failure to verify threshold before force application. Asterisk. No emotion, no commentary, just clarity. And then she moved forward. Because that was what her role required. Forward motion, not lingering reflection. But even for her, there were moments later, small ones, unrelated to the incident, where she would notice how quickly authority can become misapplied when confidence replaces verification. Not as trauma, as awareness. Back in Pike's world, a formal review board finally scheduled a closed evaluation session. Not public, not dramatic. Structured, clinical. He was asked to recount the sequence. Not defend it, recount it. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because recounting removes narrative control. It forces alignment with recorded reality. He spoke carefully at first. Then less carefully as the structure of the questioning tightened around him. What was the initial observed violation? There was perceived aggressive lane movement. Was it confirmed through instrumentation or observation alone? Observation. Was any traffic violation recorded? No. Was probable cause established prior to detention? Silence. That silence lasted longer than any answer he had given. Because it contained everything. Eventually, he spoke. No. And that was it. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just final acknowledgement of the gap that had defined the entire incident. Afterward, he sat in the waiting room alone for a long time. Not because he was told to stay. Because there was nowhere else that felt meaningfully different to go. The world outside continued without interruption. Cars passed. People walked. Phones rang. But inside him, something had changed shape permanently. Not broken, rearranged. And in that rearrangement, one realization kept returning, quieter each time but sharper in meaning. Authority is not what you assume. It is what you can still justify when no one agrees with you. And once justification is gone, all that remains is sequence. Have you ever noticed how the final truth of a moment doesn't arrive when everything is happening, but when everything has already stopped? That was how it ended. Not with a confrontation, not with another report, not with a dramatic reversal. Just a final line in a final document that confirmed what had already been understood for weeks. Closed, reconciled, recorded. Pike read it alone. No supervisor standing over his shoulder. No radio in his hand. No streetlights flashing across asphalt. Just a quiet room and a piece of paper that no longer carried uncertainty, only conclusion. The language was precise in the way institutional language always is when it wants to end a conversation without inviting response. Findings upheld. Procedural violation confirmed. Force application not justified by legal threshold. Operational restriction to remain in effect pending further departmental determination. There was no anger in it. No judgment. Only structure. And structure is the one thing that does not argue back. Pike set the paper down slowly. Not because it hurt. Because there was nothing left in it to resist. For a long time, he didn't move. Not thinking about how to fix it. Not thinking about how to explain it. Just sitting inside the quiet realization that the stop was no longer an event he could revisit as what went wrong. It had become something else entirely. A reference point. A line the system would use to measure future decisions against. Across town, Holloway had already stopped revisiting it daily. Not because he had forgotten. Because repetition no longer changed what it meant. He still thought about it sometimes in brief moments between calls. But now it came with something else attached. Caution, not fear. Awareness of how quickly certainty can become error when it stops checking itself. Monica Reed had moved forward entirely. The incident existed in her record, but not in her present. It had done what it needed to do. Document a failure of threshold recognition in another system. And once documented, it no longer required emotional retention. Only institutional memory. One evening, she stood by a window in a federal facility overlooking a city that had already moved on from every version of that night. She wasn't thinking about the confrontation. She was thinking about something quieter. How often control is mistaken for correctness when no one stops to verify the foundation underneath it. Then she turned away. And continued, forward. Back in Pike's world, there was no final moment of redemption. No apology that rewrote history. No sudden reversal of outcome. Only time passing without restoring what had been lost. And slowly, something else took its place. Not peace. Not resolution. Something more honest. Understanding. That what happened on that roadside was not a story of villains or heroes. It was a sequence where assumption replaced verification, where escalation replaced pause, and where authority moved faster than judgment. And once that sequence completed itself, it could not be undone. Only learned from. The last time Pike drove past that same stretch of road, he didn't stop. He didn't replay it. He didn't relive it. He simply looked at it once as he passed. And for the first time, he didn't see it as a moment that defined him. He saw it as a moment that taught him what definition costs when it is made too early. The street stayed the same. The traffic moved the same. The world continued without remembering. But he did, and that was the only ending it ever needed.